Should we oppose the bailout of SVB? Is Trump to blame for the bank runs? Does Hollywood have an anti-Christian bias? We'll answer these questions and more on today's episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we gather takes from all across the internet and our social media feeds. We highlight the good ones, show what they're doing good. We also highlight the bad ones, and we try and make arguments against what they are arguing for. My name is Britt. I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And before we get started, make sure to like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. It really helps us out. You can find us on Instagram at Good Take, Bad Take Pod, and on Twitter and YouTube at Good Bad Take Pod. Without further ado, let's get into some of these takes. So the first take of the day, and you're going to notice the theme with the first few today. It's going to have to do a lot with SVB. It's a bank in Silicon Valley Bank is what it's called, that recently failed. They had a run on their savings and they weren't able to support it. So they failed. And Robbie Suave, I think that's how you say his last name.
That's right. Yeah.
He tweeted out, "I'm going to do some libertarian gatekeeping here. If you are one of us, you have to oppose the SVB bailout." What do you think, Donnie?
I think that's a very good take. Robbie Suave is I think he's most the come up from Reason Magazine, which really has hit or miss record when it comes to thinkers, in my opinion. I mean, I generally am going to agree with Reason more than not, but they often produce very wrong or bad opinions on things. But Robbie is one of my favorite people from Reason, and I know he now hosts the Hills show, the Rising one, the one that Kate or Crystal Ball and Cigar, I can't remember his last name, used to host. So anyway, but he's pretty fantastic, and I really like this take because my friend texted me today, and I think he put it well, where he said Twitter today is like, if it just saves one bank, and it's insane how short-term memory works for these people when it feels like all of the political discourse from the last 15 years has been, well, the problem with the 2008 crisis was, and there are a range of answers, there are different takes, but pretty much everyone is recognizing that 2008 was a problem, and bailing out the banks did not solve the problem. It caused long-term harm. And so it is wild to see everyone rushing out here to want to support bailouts because of the short-term positives that ultimately hurt us out all in the long term here. So I think that the joke about you're not a real libertarian is an endless circle, but I think he's totally right, where if you're a libertarian, and if you at least, or even if you want to consider yourself sort of financially conservative or reasonably laissez-faire, you don't get that title if now you just want to conform to what's short and easy. You don't actually believe in the theories that are factually, historically tracked. You just care about the short term, drinking today, dying tomorrow kind of Keynesian attitude.
Yeah, I mean, I really like this take because I agree with it in general. What I kind of don't like about it is that, like, there's any bailout that libertarians would support, right? Like, you could just say blank, fill in anything, and if the word bailout comes after it, and it's a bailout by the government, then no libertarian should support that, and that's kind of like that's a purity test of pretty basic magnitude. I don't think there's much more basic than that for libertarians, but a lot of folks will say things like, well, they're just too big to fail. I mean, that was the 2008 stuff, and with the car manufacturers and everything, too big to fail. Oh, what are we going to do if we lose this or that company? I remember at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, I was talking with a guy about his pension fund, and he was like, I might have to delay retiring for a few years, but it's worth it because we need to make sure the airlines, still exist and all this stuff. I was like, man, like, what the airlines, what happened is that they rewarded bad actors, right? Like airlines that bought back their stock or gave out big bonuses, didn't have a lot of money in their savings accounts. Those guys were hit hard, and then they came crawling to the taxpayer and the government to get bailed out of their stuff. Whereas the airlines that did a good job, they didn't receive any help, right? So they had to actually dip into their savings, dip into their cash reserves. and they weren't rewarded for being good actors. And it's the same thing with these banks, right? I think about like equivalent that anyone can relate to. There was a burger place in Bellevue that my wife and I tried a few times, once with friends and then a couple times by ourselves. Every time we went, we had a bad experience. One time, the food, we had to wait for 2 hours for it to even show up. We actually left before they even came because the waitress kept coming by and refilling our stuff. And we're like, hey, when's the food? She said it's coming soon. It's like, well, we can't wait for 2 hours, right? So we eventually just stopped going. And eventually that burger place went out of business, right?
Yeah.
And that's the equivalent for these banks. If a bank doesn't have enough money, they can't keep money safe, they should go out of business. They don't deserve to be in business anymore. The market has spoken. They are not smart enough, and their assets that they have, they don't just like dissolve, right? So, I mean, maybe with the bank a little bit they do, but like with the airlines, for example, it's not like, you know, if Delta Airlines went under because they were bad actors in their executive group who did stock buybacks and gave big bonuses. It's not like all the planes they have just disappear when Delta disappears. They're able to be sold on the market for a discount. And then the people who were smart, the people who were responsible, the airline companies that were awesome, are able to buy those things up at a discount and provide even better services and expand their foothold, therefore rewarding good actors. And so, yeah, it's the most libertarian thing to oppose bailing out any sort of failed business, so long as the business has not been like destroyed by the government. And then at that point, it's not a bailout, it's a restitution, right?
Right.
For something the government did. But I don't think that's ever happened ever. But yeah, so I could think of all the businesses that were forced to shut down by the government during the COVID stuff. Those people probably do deserve, some sort of restitution by the government. But no, they never got any sort of bailout by the government. It was only these big companies and big banks and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say that kind of leads into the idea of the small business loans and then the small business loan forgiveness during COVID. Because that's kind of an interesting dynamic as well. I think what I would say about this particular take, just to address the very first thing you said, it should be any bailout for sure. But I think this is just so appalling and on the nose and like obvious really to anyone paying attention that I think that's the point of his libertarian gatekeeping here. It's not that on principle libertarians should oppose bailouts, period, like you said. But this one, it's crazy to see anyone trying to defend this. And so I think it's one of those things where you're like, I shouldn't even need to say this. If you support this, you're not a libertarian, full stop kind of thing. But I agree. I think it's any bailout. But to address what you were saying at the end here, that the difference between the government bailing out something like SVB, it almost, you almost feel bad because in a sense, the government really is the one responsible for the goings on that's going to cause SVB to be in a position where this kind of thing can happen. Obviously, it should have been done in a way where they were a lot more prudent with their money. They should have not engage. I think a lot of the problems, because it's not just SVB, there are other banks that are going out. I think there's 3 confirmed rumors of a 4th. Fractional reserve banking is a disaster that's causing all this. But on the other hand, it's one of those things where if you are reasonably trying to take 20,000, Bob Murphy actually has a great thread on this for anyone who's more interested in this. But he uses the example, and I'm probably going to butcher it, but if someone has $22,000 in savings and then the bank takes 20,000 of those dollars, so they leave $2,000 there, they take 20,000 and then they buy an asset that pays back interest rates of $1,000 a month. And then they're making money on that in that way. But then the government enacts policies where the inflation rates are such, or the interest rates are such, excuse me, that now that asset is only worth half as much. Even if you sell it, you only have $10,000 rather than the 20,000 that you bought it for, right? And then your $500 a month isn't enough to keep up with interest payments and stuff like that. So obviously SVB should not have been engaging in that kind of behavior because the Fed is going to raise interest rates. The Fed is going, but ultimately it is, it sucks. A private company has to be aware that the government exists. We can't live in this utopia land where, oh, we're completely independent. Like, we're running our business fine. It's just the government that screws up. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because we live in this world where you need to be prudent with your customers' money. We live in a world where the government is going to mess around with things. But ultimately, let's remember that it is the government that is causing these faults with the monetary system to begin with. The banks are not the best of actors, and the banks are making mistakes and misusing people's money, but the government is the one that is allowing them to, either through, and they're either willingly participating in a negligent or malicious way, or they're just doing it because it's the standard norm, because that's the condition that the government has set up. So, I agree, but we also need to remember, like, it's kind of like, yeah, the banks were bad actors in this particular instance, but the real sinister actors behind the scenes is the Fed.
Yep. And speaking of the Fed, we've got a take by Peter Schiff, and he tweets out: "The Fed is once again responsible for another financial crisis, but it's not the interest rate hikes, but the prior cuts that are to blame. As I said from the beginning, when the Fed cut rates to zero, it made a deal with the devil. The devil finally showed up to collect." What do you think, Donnie?
That's
Keep
exactly
riffing on
right.
it.
Yeah, that's no, he's nailing it here. When, in the example I gave, when I said because they raise the interest rates, your 10,000, your $20,000 asset becomes 10,000, worth $10,000, but the only reason why the Fed has to raise these rates is because they cut them in the first place artificially. I mean, really, it doesn't matter if you start raising or you start lowering interest rates. The fact that you, as an outside entity, are trying to control this artificially without real market price controls, you're trying to determine the value of money outside of an actual feedback system, you're always going to have these corrections. And the political interests have made it so that lowering interest rates is really desirable. So when you really want political gain for whatever reason, because you want to usher in some booming economy, you're going to lower them naturally, and that's where the interest is. And now you have to pay that price, like he's saying. The devil finally shows up to collect.
Yeah, I want to try to put this in Coconut Island terms.
Yes, the Coconut Island.
The Coconut Island terms,
Yes.
because I mean, when people talk about interest rates and banking and stuff like that, I remember, for me at least, it was really confusing. And I love this stuff, right? I nerd out
Yeah.
about it and read books on it. But even then, it kind of makes it topsy turvy. But the reason why a bank could potentially fail when interest rates get raised is, one, banks have 0% reserve requirements. So you think that when you put your bank money in a bank, they're keeping it in a vault somewhere and you can go collect it whenever you want. If they had 100% of your money in there all the time, then they would have 100% reserve, right? So they basically keep your money. And let's just say this bank of coconuts, this bank of coconuts only has your coconuts in it, and they always have your coconuts in it. Obviously, a bank doesn't work that way because a bank needs to make money. So what they're going to do is they're going to, of the 100 coconuts you give them, they're going to loan out 2 of them, to people, and then people are going to use those coconuts to buy other things, coconut making machines. And then they're going to charge them like, hey, if I loan you 2 coconuts, you got to return 4 coconuts to me. And that's how the bank makes money. They also give you a little bit of interest on it as well. The problem is that when, let's say, you have a bunch of coconut machines, right? People are buying coconut machines and they have a rate at which they just make coconuts out of thin air, or just make coconuts in general. And they make 5% of the coconuts that are put into it, every month or whatever it is. So those are worth X amount of whatever currency you want to put into it. But then the second you raise those interest rates, a new coconut machine comes on the market and it spits out at a higher rate, right? The coconut machines that you used to be in are no longer as valuable. And so let's say that I came and I said, hey, I want to collect my money, right? I have 100 coconuts in it. You've loaned out all of them. So there's no coconuts in there. Well, the bank would have to figure out how to get those coconuts, sell assets off that they've loaned out on, whether that's a mortgage or a property or anything like that, coconut machines. But the problem is when interest rates go up, all the mortgages, the products that they've sold are no longer as valuable because someone else can get those mortgages at a higher rate. So they're more valuable to them. So they're not able to fulfill your request, right? So now you've come to ask for your $100 or 100 coconuts back. They can only get you 50 coconuts back. And that's what causes the run on the banks. And that's why people are blaming the interest rate hikes, right, for this financial crisis, because when the Fed raised rates, it made it so that the assets that these banks had on their balance sheet are no longer worth enough. And so they can't, even if they liquidated all of the assets they had, mortgages, properties, all this stuff, they would not be able to satisfy the reserves of the people that demanded their money back that they stored with them.
Yeah, it's just a simple, almost physics level equation of, if you're lowering these interest rates artificially, they have to come back up at a, I mean, like, think about like a diving board or something. If you're like pulling down on a diving board and it's bending down and it's bending down, and then a bunch of colonies of like, I don't know, like a bunch of bugs build their nests on the end of that diving board. When you let go and it flings it up in the air, and they're like, wow, it's the problem is the fact that you let it go. And it's like, well, no, eventually the board would have snapped under the
Got to
pressure,
even out.
and you would have fallen either way. There, it's danged if you do, danged if you don't. uh and so the fact that people don't see it because the Fed is this institution that works behind the scenes, and I guess just because there's so much propaganda from people like Bernie Sanders who just want to rail against the banks. And to be clear, the banks do deserve blame for operating in practices that are, again, lend themselves to being disrupted by this kind of thing. But when the Fed is manipulating this behind the scenes, that is so much more of the problem than the banks, sort of reacting on that policy being set or not set.
Well, there was, I mean, we've talked about this movie a lot on the show, but The Big Short, and these are based off of real interviews that Michael Burry did with people when he was uncovering, before the 2008 crisis, and was able to short it in such a way that made him billions of dollars. The bankers literally said, yeah, we know we're doing these credit default swaps, and all these weird derivatives, and we're really spinning up the risk and all this stuff, but it's making us a ton of money. And if it fails, we're going to still do it because the government is going to bail us out. We know they're going to do that. So why we have no disincentive from doing this, right? It's all gain, no risk whatsoever. How can you blame anyone for having that type of, I mean, it's unethical. I agree with you. It's unethical. But from a purely profit motive standpoint, if you've got some reality, and most people take the government as not evil, right? They think the government is just neutral and it either does good things or bad things. And if there's a law, it's the will of the people and therefore it's good. Well, the government or the will of the people, put in these safeguards for the banks to look against and be like, oh man, like I can loan out all this money. I can loan out 5 houses to someone that doesn't have enough money to pay for it. And if it fails, the government's going to bail me out. So of course I'm going to do it. So you can't, most of the blame lies with the people that have provided the incentive. It's hard to blame a bank. They're evil and awful, I agree. But it's hard to blame them in acting in the interest of profit motives when there's some sort of reality that basically eliminates all risk from them. And that's, Robbie Suave's last tweet that we went over. That's the whole point. If you eliminated those incentives, and not even incentives, if you made it so there's a disincentive to acting in a bad way, to being irresponsible, then banks would suddenly stop acting irresponsible, stop putting their money in weird places. They'd actually carry money on hand without the government actually have to putting in a reserve requirement. Because in order for them to stay in business, they have to be trustworthy. If they're not trustworthy, people aren't going to bank with them. So yeah, because those incentives and disincentives don't exist, and they are artificially manipulated by the Federal Reserve and by legislation that basically eliminates all risk for these folks, they're going to act in that way. And they definitely have a lot of the blame in that they can lobby, right? They do lobby for all this stuff, but that doesn't take away the fact that the lever to lobby for is there in the first place. And therefore, I think that's the most evil part of it.
Right. It's one of those things where even if you somehow were to abolish all of these evil banker corporate people and you wipe them clean somehow and you install a fresh set of virtuous new banks, you still and you don't change anything with the Fed, you don't change anything with the government, those banks are then going to become corrupt, and slowly they're going to twist back into the old system where it's like, yeah, okay, so the banks are to blame that they had people doing bad actions. But when you're putting those banks in a mold to do that, then of course they are going to end up that way. Human will is only so powerful against temptation that great. So yeah, I think that people tend to only focus on one or the other in some cases. And to me, it's, yeah, the banks made poor choices, but that's because of the structure that exists from the government, and we need to address that ultimately.
All right, moving on to our next one. In the same vein, I said a lot of SVB stuff.
Yes.
We've got Melissa Tate, and she tweets out, No, it's not Peter Thiel or President Trump who's to blame for bank runs and SVB collapsing. It's because of Biden inflation forcing the Fed to raise interest rates. Our banking system is not designed to withstand the massive rate hikes we have seen under this regime. And then there's an infographic: Joe Biden inherited inflation, question mark. And it shows Joe Biden's first month in office, which is January 2021, and then basically a hockey stick of monthly inflation rate going all the way up. Everything before it was Trump, and it's pretty low. What do you think, Donnie? Good or bad take?
It's such a bad take. I mean, how many times do we have to repeat this idea that, you know, inflation takes time to occur? Inflation isn't one of those things where you print out all of the money. Well, let's pretend you could do it all in one day, right? It's not like this course of weeks and weeks and months of printing out all the money that they're printing. Let's pretend it's done in one day. Even then, you have to circulate that money. You then have to have people respond to the new circulation of money by reacting to, oh, I am now, in the possession of a lot more money than I once was. This is now worth less compared to the goods that I have, which haven't just magically been printed. And then that goes through the rest of the economy. We've talked about how inflation always benefits the wealthy because they're the first circulations who get it. And so while prices are still, not accounting for the level of inflation that is about to hit them, they use the money in ways to buy up assets and things like that. And then by the time the money's all fully circulated, then inflation raises. And so, sure, the money might distribute, but the prices are higher, and the lower classes have not actually had a chance to get that. Yada, yada. All that being said, that takes time. And so to act as though it all occurred when Biden took office and then all of a sudden inflation shot up ignores the fact that Trump was the one who signed the biggest spending bill in history. And frankly, is to ignore the past history of the other factors leading up to inflation, namely the 2008 crisis, which just kicked the can down the road to begin with, of this whole. And to be clear, before the 2008 crisis as well, just the 2008 crisis is a good long-term point to say, like, that was a big inflection point where we would have seen similar fallout and we would have seen similar kinds of reckonings, except that we chose to bail things out. We chose to try to kick the can down the road. And now you're seeing an even bigger buildup than before.
Yep. Yeah, this is the equivalent of saying like I'm remodeling a house right now, so I think about this, and I had some issues with water the other day, and it's Trump went into the basement, turned on the faucet, let the water get up to waist level in the basement, and then Joe Biden got in, and it was like, oh crap, there's like some rot. We need to start draining this water out of here, and he turns off the faucet, the equivalent of rate hikes, basically. And as it recedes, you discover like, oh crap, like this water has been sitting in here for 4 years and everything's rotten and moldy and it's dying and the house is going to collapse. This Melissa Tate is saying, oh, it's Biden's fault because he drained the water out of here. And I'm not saying Biden's doing a good job either. I mean, in a lot of ways, he's actually filling it back up. He's draining out the old water and filling it with a bunch of new water still as well.
Right.
So all presidents print a ton of money. But the reason we're experiencing inflation right now is because of the $6 trillion CARES Act bill that Trump did, as well as the fact that he kept hammering on the Fed to keep interest rates low, right? Yeah. Whenever Janet Yellen wanted to raise the interest rates, he kept saying, no, they shouldn't do that, because he wanted to have the facade of an awesome economy where it was easy to get money and money was cheap, and Americans could afford things that they actually couldn't afford, or they had the perception that they could afford it when they couldn't. And now we're paying the price for it, as Peter Schiff said before. So, yeah, they're both to blame. They're both awful. I mean, I'm kind of terrified to see once Biden's actual inflation, the results of his spending and printing and policies actually start having effect. It's going to be really terrifying to see what happens there. But the stuff that we're all encountering right now, it's basically all due to Donald Trump's policies and everything that he did, as well as, the foundation that Obama established and George W. Bush. Every president before them prints tons of money, wants to artificially raise or lower interest rates depending on their agenda. And so, the only healthy interest rate you can have is the one that's set by the market, where a bank individually decides, like, this is the rate at which we are going to loan out at. It doesn't matter if it's 0% or if it's at 100%. If the bank decides to loan out at that, and there are customers who want to borrow from them or give them money to loan out, then it's a good interest rate. But when the Fed artificially forces them one way or the other, it's not going to be good, and it's going to create these weird scenarios with tons of collateral.
I remember having a conversation. I wish I could remember if it was. I think it was during the Obama presidency, and the economy wasn't doing well, and because it was right after this 2008 crisis. I think we were probably in 2009, something like that, pretty fresh. And I remember having a very low level discussion with someone about the economy not doing well, and how, well, we'll see what happens when Democrats get elected. And that person said, well, no, I mean, that just is what happened, is because of everything that Bush did. And then Obama inherited it. And then you look back and it was like, yeah, things were good under Bush, but that's because Bill Clinton was elected right before him. And then right at the end, what do you know? And that's always the pattern. And I remember feeling so torn up, because I was like, oh my gosh, is my entire perception wrong? Is it true that Republicans are wrecking the economy, and it's just Democrats are just inheriting and then cleaning up the mess and then making it better? But of course, what I didn't see there is, one, to have a non-multivariate analysis of what's causing these things is very, very immature and childish. And two, these cyclical things might have happened along party lines, but the parties were pretty irrelevant, because every party has been doing this and playing the same game. So yeah, you see the cycles, but it's not. And I think, as the Trump Biden sort of inversion of that might show, it's not really about a particular time being good or bad under a red or blue president. It's all about the monetary, what the Fed is allowing or not allowing, or messing up or not messing up. And so it was just really funny how people will see what they want to see in the colors, just like this person sees, oh, Biden elected, huge spike of inflation. That's the only cause. But you really need to take a step back and look at the whole monetary policy. You need to look at how the market reacts, because even with such heavy government involvement and interference and spending bills and Fed setting these interest rates, the reason why inflation shoots up, the reason why all these things happen, is because the basic principle of economics is that humans make choices and humans react to things. So when these policies take place, the market in large part reacts. So you print a bunch of money and the market says, okay, there are a lot more dollars than there are apples now, and so the ratio is different. So now you're going to need to give me more dollars for this apple I have, since there's way more of those than there are of apples. So those dollars are worth less. And so you need to think about things like that, and how the market is going to react to that. The market, the stock market might react to, oh, we elected a pro-business president, or a anti-business president, but really that's just one part of the economy. When the monetary policy is being set by people, your reactions are going to be more than just red or blue is in office, I think.
Yeah. Yep. And I mean, just like we saw with the Syria vote last week, when it comes to the important stuff, whether it's bailouts or war, conveniently, basically the entire Democrat and Republican Party agrees, and they're unanimous. So it's not really one or the other. It's just there's one bad party that drives these policies, and they're incentivized to drive them.
Yes, exactly right.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got a tweet by Joshua Reed Eagle. I'm not really sure how to say his name. A little bit of an antagonist to people that we like, but let's see if his take is good. He writes, under no circumstances should a political party or the leadership of a political party endorse candidates from the opposition. This is politics 101. What do you think?
I think this is a bad take. I think you can look at this from a number of factors and think this is a bad take.
Yeah.
One, the first thing I'll say is, if you're talking about politics, there are almost no hard and fast absolute rules. The very game and nature of politics is so slimy and so wheeling and dealing, that if you are saying under no circumstances, you are probably not going to be a political winner in any case. I mean, think about it this way. I wonder if this guy thinks that, for instance, any of the Republican parties, individuals, leaders, or something should have opposed Trump in any way, shape, or form. Because something tells me he would be very supportive of the sort of against Trump movement within Republican circles, but that would be completely the antithesis of his point here. You can say that a party might need to endorse another political party's candidate in, let's say your candidate gets embroiled in a scandal or something like that, right? You probably might want to endorse someone else to save the party. Maybe you sack this candidate to save the party. But beyond that, of course, is, do we even want to look at this through the political lens?
Yeah.
Ideally, a political party shouldn't just be a Machiavellian gain to power. It should be, in its best iteration, a set of ideals and principles in an organized fashion, mobilizing people who believe in these principles and ideas to get into office, to enact good policy, and to help people live freer lives, in my opinion. And so if there are candidates who can do that better than your party can because of the structural realities of the state you're in or the area you're in, because of the quality of the candidates, because of inter-party politics, whatever the realities, then a party should choose the option that is the best to achieve the purpose of the party. And in this case, it's sort of the he's not saying it outright, but he's talking about endorsing liberty Republicans instead of endorsing libertarians. And to me, it's like, if there are good people, and the point of the Libertarian Party is to make the country more free, and there are people in the Republican Party who are liberty minded who are going to do that, then I think endorsing them is the proper action when you do not have a better chance at winning, or a reasonable chance, I think, at winning.
Yeah, and to kind of clarify for the audience that isn't involved in some of these circles or looks at it on Twitter, he's very much criticizing people like Dave Smith, who endorsed and still endorse candidates like Ron Paul or Rand Paul or Thomas Massey, even Tulsi Gabbard in some instances, who are not libertarian, right? I don't think Tulsi Gabbard's libertarian now, but she's definitely not. She's not Democrat anymore either. Mm-hmm. But other folks, obviously Republican, right, or ran Republican when they were in politics, and it's like this type of principled stance is kind of the only thing libertarians have got going for them in a lot of ways, right? Like it's our differentiating factor, it's our strength, it's the selling proposition of why you should go with us, is that we adhere to a principle. The other parties do not. The only principle they have is power. They exist to get people with an R or a D next to their name elected, regardless of whether or not they actually like their principles or not. I actually shouldn't say that. Regardless of whether or not they are saying the right things, as long as they have the R by their name and they're willing to play ball with the establishment on either side, they want them to get elected. And so that's what libertarians are awesome on, or should be awesome on. It's like, hey, look, we support whoever's going to bring about liberty. To borrow the kind of the older parties thing, it's like, to see a world set free in our lifetime. That catchphrase. Like, that really is, though, the point of the Libertarian Party is to advance these ideas. We don't believe that we can just take power, right? Like, we don't want to take power. That's kind of the antithesis of what we're trying to do in a lot of ways. We're trying to make everyone more free. And if we have to gain a little power to do that, then maybe we have to do that. But we want to win by changing people's minds, because that's how we believe actual change happens. Dave Smith said, if we get 10% of the population, 30 million people said, nope, we're not doing this or not doing that. Like, it'd be an unstoppable force. And I can't remember if it was him or someone else, but they gave the example of the Amish, right? The Amish don't pay tax like you and I pay tax. They don't have sales tax. I mean, maybe they do, but they don't have certain types of income tax. They don't have to pay into Social Security or Medicaid or Medicare or anything like that. I mean, there's only 500,000 of them or so, and they just said, nope, we're not going to do it. And they are of one mindset and belief that they shouldn't do that. So how much more can we change people's minds by pushing principles rather than people? And I don't care whether you're Democrat or Republican. If you're good on the principle and you are useful in advancing that message, then I want to work with you. I want you to be part of what we're doing, and I'm going to keep pushing you out there. And then the second you do a bad job, it's like, we're going to criticize you and and all that stuff. So it's founded on principle, and this is not principle. This is literally, I mean, this is where it is a good take. It is politics 101 to only back whoever is part of your party, regardless of whether they actually adhere to your principles or not. So he got that part right, but I think the general point he's trying to make is pretty bad, at least for the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, I agree. The funny thing is, this individual would probably, I assume, you know, follow and have no issues with Justin Amash, who I like, for the record. I think Amash is great, but Amash is a little bit more, inline standard, not as radical as some other people that I also like. But Justin Amash was the most libertarian representative in the House for most of my life. Ron Paul was in the House during some of my lifetime as well. But to think that, Josh would say, "Oh, we can't endorse Justin Amash because he's a Republican," it's just such a funny concept. It's just such a, like, the on the nose absolute hilarity. Sure, you can make that claim about Thomas Massey. You can make that claim about Rand Paul. I think you're a little bit ridiculous, but I can see there are some very marked differences from libertarian policy that those two engage in. Like, I would say Rand is way more pro-police than the average libertarian is, and Massey probably the same, would be my guess. Some of that's politics, some of that's probably their actual individual feelings, but fine, whatever. But Amash is literally a libertarian. He left and declared himself libertarian, was the first libertarian member of Congress before he retired. But because he was a Republican for most of those years, should Equal not have endorsed him? Or does the person and their ideas and the principles they hold and act on, should that trump a stupid label that they're using to get into that office? Because to me, I think the Libertarian Party would have looked like an absolute buffoon, and I would not have taken it seriously, and I didn't take it seriously for many years, if they had, tried to run a libertarian candidate against Justin Amash or had refused to endorse him. It would be the height of hubris. It would be the height of a turnoff, and you would lose people who just want to see, realistic human beings, not this absolute dogmatism to a letter that, that just seems absurd to me personally. I don't know. That doesn't seem like politics 101, because I think you lose a lot of people who want to accomplish the same goal as you. But then I'm not going to join the Libertarian Party if they refuse to endorse down to earth, real good candidates like Eric Brakey because he's running as a Republican.
Yeah.
Like, that's stupid to me, because you could literally change nothing about Eric Brakey. You could change the R to an L, and then he would be worthy of the endorsement, according to this guy. But if a party's too blind to see that, I don't think they're worth supporting.
I agree. All right. Moving to our next one, and we've got a spoiler warning. And I wish I'd read this because I haven't seen this episode yet, but it's okay.
Oh,
Donnie put it in here without consulting me, and I skipped right to the last slide. But it's a spoiler warning for The Last of Us, and it's a tweet by Rainn Wilson, and it's actually not that big of a spoiler. So
yeah.
But just be forewarned that it's there if you're watching the show. Yeah. And Rainn Wilson tweeted out, "I do think that there is an anti-Christian bias in Hollywood. As soon as the David character in The Last of Us started reading from the Bible, I knew he was going to be a horrific villain. Could there be a Bible reading preacher on a show who is actually loving and kind?" What do you think?
I think this is a good take. So apologies for that spoiler.
Oh, you're good. You're good. I don't think it revealed much. I don't even know who David is. So
well, and I was gonna say the funny thing, of course, is it's one of those things where I haven't seen this episode yet. I haven't really been watching the show. It kind of, but it's such an obvious trope that if I were to see that, I would as well soon instantly know that exact same, because there are two kinds of faithful, or not faithful. There are two kinds of portrayals of Christians from Hollywood. There is one, the Christian who is orthodox in some way, shape, or form, or holds to traditional beliefs or traditional things, and then has something terribly wrong with them. Whether that's, like in this case, they're a horrible villain, or maybe they got put into a position where they compromise their morals in a horrible way. That is always, or they are a good guy. They are a protagonist and seen as loving, but they also happen to just hold very liberal beliefs that just go along with everything the culture
Yep.
wants you to hold. Those
Yep.
are the two kinds of Christians that are shown in Hollywood. And I would argue that the second is not a preacher who is loving and kind, and it
Yep.
does fall under that anti-Christian bias because it is taking an anti-Orthodox Christian stance, and it says if we are going to show a good Christian, it's the only kind that we can show is the kind that conforms away from the traditional beliefs of that faith and stuff. So I just thought this was interesting in particular because it came from Rainn Wilson, who if you don't know is the actor who played Dwight on The Office, Dwight Schrute.
I think he's Muslim, actually.
He is. I don't know if he's Muslim. I know he's vaguely spiritual. He might be like Hindi or something. Maybe he's like a Buddhist or something.
Yeah, he's a Buddhist.
That's what I know he's very he's one of the more interesting people out there in that he is spiritual, but I genuinely think he actually strives for some level of tolerance, where I think a lot of people say the word tolerance and then they don't actually mean it. And even if I don't agree with all of Rainn Wilson, what he does or doesn't tolerate, I think he, unlike many, makes a real effort to embody that ideal in some form.
Yeah, I think if I take this at face value, I think it's good. And I agree with you. I think Rainn Wilson's one of the better people in Hollywood on this topic in general. Like, actually, kind of adheres to that what tolerance actually is. But I just take a ton of issue with like here's a good example. There's a show called Love Is Blind. I don't know if you've ever watched it.
Oh yeah.
So I think it was this last season. Maybe it was the one before that. I can't remember.
It was this one. I think I know what you're talking about. Right?
Yeah, I can't remember the guy's name, but anyways, he was the topic of abortion came up, and and he's just like, yeah, I wouldn't. It's kind of messed up to kill your baby. Basically, is what the dude said to the gal. I don't even remember their names. And the show kind of went out of its way to portray this guy as like crazy, a dinosaur, outdated, hateful, doesn't support women's rights and stuff. And it's like, that's Hollywood's definition of what loving and kind is, right? Like, I believe he's kind of a Christian, like he had some like cross thing or whatever.
Yeah, I think there were a lot of cultural Christians in that because it was filmed in Texas.
You can't be a Christian and be on that show. I don't think. Like, it's
probably not. Yeah,
kind of weird to do that. Like, a Christian, a true Christian moral set doesn't allow for you to sleep with your spouse before you're married. And in that show, I think they almost all do, unless they don't get married. But regardless, I mean, that's Hollywood's definition, right? And I remember another one of my friends had a neighbor come up to them and say, hey, like, why are Christians just so unloving? And this person was acting all convicted about that. It's like, well, dude, like, you got to ask what they mean by that, right? Like, if they say unloving, as in like, well, you don't want women to be able to kill babies, and you want to, you don't agree with this or that. Christians view, one, like, you got to protect the lives of the innocent. And then two, there's certain types of lifestyles that are best for human flourishing. And that if you deviate from those, like, you actually damage yourself, and it's not loving to not correct that. And so in the same way that you would, grab a person's hand before they walk into ongoing traffic on accident, like, that's how a Christian views it. And that's loving, right? It wouldn't be loving if you actually believe they're doing something damaging to themselves. So I just don't like the world's, like, Hollywood's view of what Christian loving and kind is. Like, they kind of straw man it, right? They say, like you were saying, if there is a Christian that's looked favorably in a Hollywood movie, they say, oh, well, they portray them as this really accepting, cool, down for whatever kind of thing. And it's like, well, that's not actually what a Christian is, right? Like, a Christian actually, like, in the Bible, talks about the way is narrow. It's very hard to walk that lifestyle because it's not going to permit a lot of things, right? And it's of the belief that there's a certain way to live that is best, that is according to the design that God has given us. And so therefore, a lot of things that normal people would normally do, like, Christians don't do, because it's not part of what we're supposed to do. So yeah, I think I like the take in general, because I think it's kind of courageous in a lot of ways, because even though I don't like what his definition of loving and kind probably is, it's still standing up for a group that you probably are not allowed to stand up for in Hollywood. So good for Rainn Wilson on doing that. Very Dwight of him.
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. I think that, I think that even if he had worded that last sentence a little differently, I think it would still fit into the spirit of what he's saying,
Yeah.
where it would almost be, could there be a Bible reading preacher on a show who is dynamic? Maybe like
Yeah.
even that word would fit that, where they're just not the ridiculous painted villain.
Yeah.
you know, I think even in, I can't remember if it was Far Cry 4 or 5. I don't know, but the main villain on that, and you're like, oh, it's a cult. Oh boy, can't wait for them to start preaching Christian teaching and stuff. But
Yeah.
the thing that's so insidious about in The Last of Us, again, this isn't I don't think this is really spoiler to it, but just kind of fleshes out the character of this. He's a villain, but they go out of their way to stress that it isn't it is pretty orthodox teaching stuff. And I think they make his character say something like, well, I don't even believe that stuff. But they go out of their way to show that what he is preaching isn't like this very, very twisted, departed version, right? It's this very traditional kind of Christianity thing. And so, I think that that's part of the reason, because even when you have these liberal interpretations that are shown as the good guys, but they're basically milk toast nothings, you that doesn't come across as Christian. That's not their primary identity, and I think that that's intentional, because the bias, I think, also extends to when when you're shown someone who in this case is like a preacher, but they're tolerant and have lefty values. They don't try to primarily promote the identity as Christian. They promote their identity as tolerant,
Yeah.
as
Yep.
like, oh, this person is the loving, tolerant caretaker person. They're not shoving in, this person believes in Jesus Christ and is that Jesus is the Son of God, and was literally resurrected. And they're not emphasizing the orthodoxy and the Christian faith in that character. They're emphasizing all the liberal values they want, which
Yep.
again I read as an anti-Christian bias. So I think that even one of those portrayals doesn't fit into this Rainn Wilson paradigm he's set up. I think the bias would be shaken if you portray a Christian in a way that they are resolute in their faith. Maybe they even, you don't even have to preach against the liberal values you don't want, but you can make that character disagree and still be loving and kind,
Yep.
right? I actually think of, and I didn't watch this show super closely. It was on a lot, and I've seen like a lot of episodes or parts of episodes, but I didn't follow it, so I don't know the exact characters, but I think it was the Last Kingdom, and it takes place in like the early days of England before it was fully formed and stuff like that. And so you have the Saxons and the warring lands there, and so there's a lot of Christian influence there with priests and things like that. And then you also have Viking spirituality and stuff. And one thing I appreciated was at least a one or two recurring characters, from what I recall, was a devout, Christian of the Anglo-Saxon god or whatever, and the protagonist is not. But the Anglo-Saxon priest wasn't saying things like, well, you have your gods and I have mine. Like, he was very much like, hey, I hope you'll convert someday,
Yeah.
to the main character. And then he's like, oh, well, my ancestors called me for, whatever the Norse stuff is. So they didn't make it, I wish they did, but they didn't make the main character convert or say that was the right way. But they also didn't, for historically accurate reasons, they didn't make the priest this tolerant, like, oh, well, I'm sure that Valhalla is just as real as my, version of heaven. And that to me is a really, that's how you can portray that without, feeling, if you're Hollywood and you're worried about being overly Christian, there are ways to not do that. And generally it makes the writing and the characters better when you do that, because it makes them real people, not just these cartoonish villains that could be come up with by someone in the 5th grade writing their creative fiction.
Yeah, it's just honest portrayals, right? That we are not fake, and that's what movies and shows are supposed to do, is
Yeah.
portray, say something about reality that is truer than true, right? It's not a documentary or something that actually happened. In some cases it is, but it's displaying a principle that plays out across all of time. And when they portray Christians one way or the other, and maybe in some instances it is true, but in general, if it's always bent one way, then they're missing something. And so I appreciate when Rainn Wilson's saying it, I guess, at the end of the day, even though I don't probably agree with what he actually thinks is loving and kind, but still
Right.
stands good.
Yeah, agree.
Awesome. Well, folks, thanks for hanging out with us. This is our last one. Again, please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and let us know if you had any thoughts on any of these takes that we did, and we will catch you on the next one.